Well, good morning, everybody, and a very happy New Year. It's lovely to see everybody here. This presentation is going to focus almost exclusively upon the actual figure of Jesus on the cross. As I'm sure you're aware, the Passion story includes a multiple of different kinds of scenes, and it would be totally unmanageable to deal with them all, and also focusing almost exclusively on the figure of Jesus on the cross brings out in a very remarkable way, I think, some of the extraordinary changes and developments of theological understanding over the years. Just to remind you very quickly, of course, we begin in the catacombs, where there are literally thousands of inscriptions relating to the deceased. Important to note, there is no depiction of the crucifixion in the catacombs, or indeed in the very earliest Christian art, as will emerge. The main themes, first of all, of course, there was simply a simple cross on many of these inscriptions. There, the pax for peace, and the alpha and the omega, taken, of course, from Revelation 1:8, where Jesus is described as the beginning and the end, the alpha and the omega. But sometimes it goes beyond a bare sign to a more mysterious symbol, and I think I just showed that before to remind you. The fish, of course, was an early symbol of Christ in the catacombs, because the first letters of the Greek word Jesus Christos Theochios Soter mean Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour. And the great 2nd century theologian Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century about baptism, says, "But we small fishes, named after our great ichthus," that is the Greek word for fish, and as I say, makes up Jesus Christ, are born in water, and only by remaining in water can we live. So you see the two fishes clinging to the anchor, which of course was a symbol of hope both in the Roman world and for Christians, but the anchor makes a sign of the cross, so they're also clinging to the cross. And this is an epitaph to Antonia in the Catacomb of Domitilla. You can see all except for the alpha at the beginning of her name at the top. But the most important way in which those early Christians depicted their faith was actually through a number of different kind of figures. And if you remember, I showed before on the development of early Christian art the cycle of the Jonah story. Jonah being thrown off the ship, being swallowed by the whale, being regurgitated by the whale, and then resting in paradise. Just to remind you, if you remember, that used the last scene used a Roman image of Endymion and Selene, the goddess, which had been used as a prototype, as it were, of Jonah resting in paradise. And this takes its theme from Matthew 12:40, where Jesus says that there'll be no sign for this generation except for the sign of Jonah. And then Matthew adds a gloss about the death and the resurrection in 3 days. So obviously this, for the early Christians, was a very important sign of their deliverance from death, based upon the death and the resurrection of Christ. But we get to a much more significant, perhaps, image later on with this 4th century sarcophagus. So have a good look at the upper register of that. Have a look at that upper register. Just stop talking for 2 seconds so you can look at that upper register. First of all, of course, you note the prevalence of wreaths. There's a wreath in almost every one of those scenes. Then, just going from the left as you look at it, there is Simon of Cyrene being forced to carry the cross. Then there's Jesus being crowned with a wreath over on the right-hand side. The third one along, a very large figure, is Jesus, and you note, relating to an earlier lecture on Jesus in art, of course, Jesus is depicted as a young beardless Roman, and then on the far right is Pontius Pilate and his wife, and his having his hands washed, saying that he'll nothing to do with it. So the prevalence of the wreath, but in particular, of course, that big wreath in the middle. The wreath was very usual image in the Roman world to indicate victory, not only in sporting contests, but in poetic competitions. It was often also worn by the gods. But the most important image, of course, is that central one, which on the one hand is the cross, but is also the resurrection, because, and the empty tomb, because at the bottom you can see two soldiers sleeping, and then on the top, on the crossbars of the crossbar, are two doves going out to send the mission of peace to the world. And the cross there is in the form of Chi-Rho, the first two letters of the Greek word for Christ. And the reason for that, as some of you will know, is that just before the great battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, which enabled Constantine to win a victory and the imperial throne, he, according to Eusebius, his church historian, saw a cross in the sky saying, "In this sign conquer." He did win that battle, and after that he adopted this Chi-Rho sign as his main military banner on the laburnum of his soldiers. And you have a very good example of that, for instance, in the coins of the period. There's the coin of the Emperor Jovian in the third quarter of the 4th century. You can see there the Chi-Rho on the labarum of the soldier on the back of his coin, and then a slightly different one, a cross, his successor Valens, but it's still a banner with a cross on. Now, have a look at this. This is a very remarkable image, which I only came across of relatively recently. It's an engraved gem, but it is a magical amulet from the late 3rd or the 4th century. It's a bloodstone intaglio, that is a stone which has been incised, covered in magical names. Now, it appears that the name of Christ crucified was taken in many quarters in that world at that time as giving power over death, and it was used even by pagan magicians. Magical amulets were very widely used in the Greco-Roman world. They were condemned, of course, by the church, but the custom persisted. And this is probably the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross, with some very unusual features. He's not nailed to the cross. He's being hanging down by straps. His head is bearded and looking to one side. His ears, his legs are akimbo. He's naked with his legs akimbo, perhaps indicating his vulnerability, but how his vulnerability can also, through the use of this amulet, conquer death. But a very, very remarkable, unorthodox use of a Christian image. And we have another very unusual one also on a stone. This is an engraved gem with the crucifixion from the mid-4th century. Instead of just Mary and John being at the crucifixion, all the apostles are. And we know from sarcophagi that's probably a scene of the apostles taking their wreaths to Christ, the victor on the cross. Now, the first, as what you might call orthodox depiction of Jesus on the cross did not appear until the first half of the 5th century. This is a crucifixion scene on the wooden doors of St. Sabina in Rome, dating from 432. Now, it has puzzled, and it still puzzles art historians and theologians, as to why the image of the cross of Christ on the cross was so late in appearing in Christian art. Now, there are a number of suggested reasons, all of which have some plausibility. First of all, crucifixion at the time, of course, was a badge of shame. It was as though a new religious group today adopted the gallows or the electric chair as their main religious symbol. And we also know, as I'll show you in a minute, that Christians were very often mocked for worshipping, or apparently worshipping, a god on the cross. This is a very remarkable, famous image found on the servants' quarters on the Palatine Palace. And it's a picture of an ass-headed Christ on the cross, with somebody mocking him to one side, and the inscription, Alexamenos worships his God. So obviously Christians, and sometimes apparently they were mocked for worshipping an ass for whatever reason, they were mocked for worshipping a god on the cross, and that, linked with crucifixion, made it another reason why they did not do it. But at the beginning of the 5th century, we get this depiction. This is a little bit earlier than the carvings on the door St. Sabina. This dates from 420, and this is the first depiction of Jesus on the cross, which appeared in Orthodox circles as opposed to that magical gem. Now here you note that the figure of Jesus on the cross is juxtaposed with the figure of Judas committing suicide. At his feet are the 30 pieces of silver spilling out of his bag. The tree in Roman funeral iconography was a symbol of paradise, so there's the symbol of paradise there with a couple of birds in it bringing peace to the world. But Jesus himself there is very much alive on the cross. His eyes are wide open, his arms are akimbo, and he has a very strong muscular body, which apparently in Roman times was also a sign for divinity, as it were, a very, very beautiful, strong, masculine body. So we have the contrast of the defeat of Jesus contrasted with the triumph of Jesus over evil and death. Now, moving on a bit to about another 150 years to the year 586. This is from the Rebula Gospel. Rebula was probably the head of the scriptorium of the monastery in present-day Syria. We have to remember that Syriac Christianity was also a very, very important form of Christianity in those days, even though it's not so well known today. Note that here, in the year 586, Christ is also alive and vigorous on the cross. His eyes are open, his body is not sagging, and he's wearing what is called a colobium, not the loincloth which the previous image had. And as this contrasts with the two naked thieves, there may be an intention here to indicate something priestly about his presence on the cross. But what I find particularly interesting about this image is that it is immediately set above the image of the resurrection, or the empty tomb, in the register below, because there you have the empty tomb, you have the women appearing to the angel and finding it empty on one side, and you have the scene known as the Kyrete, Jesus greeting the women on the other side, and the guards, as it were, thrown aside by the force of the resurrection. This one always brings to mind that Easter carol, Christ has burst his 3-day prison. But I think what is important to note is that in the same way as that 4th century sarcophagus that I showed you, where the Cairo and the cross and the wreath of victory were all juxtaposed on the, or as it were, superimposed on the empty tomb, so that the cross and the resurrection were seen as one unified event. So also, I think here the intention is that the cross and the resurrection should be seen as one unified event. They wanted to depict the cross, Christ on the cross, not as in any way defeated, but triumphant over evil and death. It was a unified truth of the victorious Christ. I showed this one before on the development of Christian art, and the reason why I'm showing it again is because I want you just to look above the figure of Jesus on his throne overlooking Rome to that cross above there. Because in the 4th century, when Constantine was converted to Christianity, his mother, Helena, came to Jerusalem and identified the sites associated with Jesus, in particular the site where he was crucified and from which he rose to the dead. And Constantine had erected outside the Church of the Sepulchre a huge jeweled cross. And this clearly is an image of that huge jeweled cross. It dates from the year 400, the crux gemata, the jeweled cross, in the Church of St. Pudenziana in Rome. And it's not surprising when pilgrims came from all over the world and saw that cross, they wanted to recreate similar kinds of crosses back in their own country. This is a pillar stone at Reisk in County Kerry, dating from the 7th century. And of course, what's so interesting about this, use the traditional art forms of the Celts with the spirals and the flowers. But perhaps even more interesting is this stone from Tipperary in a place called Haney, dating from a little bit later, the 8th or the 9th century, because the jewel cross outside the Church of Holy Sepulchre was wood, but it was encased in metal and jewels, great jewels and metal clad. And clearly there's been an attempt on this Haney cross and other crosses of a similar type to, as it were, reproduce in stone something of the character and quality of that jewel cross in Jerusalem. And here's another picture of the Haney cross, and I've shown this one because it shows the base, because the stepped base that you see these crosses, these stone crosses, was meant to indicate Golgotha. That is the Mount of Golgotha at the bottom. Here's another one from Northern Ireland. Obviously, they began to inscribe these with scenes from the life of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ. This is Muirdoch's cross from Monaster Boyce, the 9th, 10th century, again Irish. It's a close-up of that scene. And here is a very famous cross from Rothwell in Scotland, the Rothwell cross, dating from the 8th century. And what is interesting about this is that it is covered in a rune, and translated, that gives us some of the earliest English poetry. The Dream of the Rood. You can see that's there, but it's on that cross. But I'll just quote a couple of verses of that. The tree itself, borne on the air, light wound about it, a beam of brightest wood, a beacon clad in overlapping gold, glancing gems fair at its foot, and 5 stones set in a crux flashed from the cross tree. Around it angels of God all gazed upon it, since its first fashioning fair. It wasn't a felon's gallows, for holy ghosts beheld it there, and men on mould, and the whole making for it, signum of victory. So it was this signum of victory, these stone crosses that were seen in Jerusalem and taken right to the edges of the Roman world and further to the east in Ireland, and also further to the west in Armenia. This is actually not an ancient Armenian one, it's a more modern Armenian one, but this is very typical Armenian cross, which has really remained unchanged over hundreds, if not 1,000 years. One from Armenia, and that's just a close-up of that. Now, what happened when the Crusaders, what happened to this cross is that it was captured by the Persians when Jerusalem was captured, But then the Emperor Heraclius recaptured it and returned the cross to triumph in Jerusalem in the year 629. And this gave rise to the Christian feast of the uplifting or the exaltation of the true cross. And stories of this were brought to the west by the Crusaders. And so if you go to Arezzo in Italy, you'll find a great cycle of paintings by Piero della Francesca, of which this is one, where Helena is kneeling as the true cross is discovered. I'm sure some of you have seen those paintings of Piero della Francesca at Arezzo. Now for something a little bit different, having looked at that. This is an ivory plaque from Metz in the 9th century. It was originally a jewelled book cover. There was a revival of classical art, as I think I mentioned before, under Charlemagne, who was created the Roman emperor in 800. But it wasn't the classical art of the Roman world. It was the Christian classical art that had begun to develop under Constantine and later under Justinian. They wanted to recreate this, as it were, Roman Christian civilization. And here on this book cover, the message they're above all trying to convey is that of Christ as the King and Redeemer of the whole cosmos. At the top are angels. To one side of Christ is the church, with the church taking the redeeming blood from his side. On the other side is the synagogue, as it were, rejecting this. And then on either side, below that, are the dead raising from their tombs. And then right at the bottom are images, traditional images of the sea and the earth. And I think on this one at the foot of the cross, I think you can see it, some of them anyway have got a snake wound round, but perhaps that's not there. I can't really see it. Sometimes the snake is there depicting evil, as it were, being banished. But there, as I say, is what they're wanting to convey above all is Christ, the King and Redeemer of the cosmos. Now this image of Christ as the King on the cross, continued with the next ruling dynasty, the Ottonian dynasty. And this is one side of what is called the Lothair cross, dating from the year 1000, with a cameo of Augustus on the front, indicating again they see themselves as the heirs of the Roman civilization. The Ottonians, like the Carolinians, pursued renovatio, that is, the renewal of society and art in the light of the Christian Roman past of the 4th to the 6th century. And they emphasized the kingly rule of Christ, underlying the sacral basis of their own sovereignty. So on the front of this Lothair processional cross, as the priest came down, and perhaps also the emperor behind that, there was an image of kingship, of triumph. But on the back, that's a close-up of the cameo, just so you can see that. They would have seen that on the front, a wonderful image of Augustus and of kingly rule. But on the back, facing the emperor as it was coming down, was this very, very different image, which is an image of Christ dead on the cross and humiliated. And there was an emphasis in the 10th century, a new emphasis upon the humanity of Christ, which included his painful death, as I'll be bringing out. And the Ottonian concept of sovereignty integrated royalty and humility in a very interesting way, because the motto of Matilda, the mother of Otto I, was dignitas cum humilitate, dignity with humility. So at the front of the cross, Lothair cross, conveyed the dignity, and the back of it, facing the sovereign, conveyed the humility which the sovereign had to bear in mind. Now this is one of the most moving depictions, in my view, of Jesus on the cross in the first 1,000 years. This is the Garowe Crucifix from Cologne, dated the year 975. You'll see here there's no undue emphasis on suffering, but there is a great poignancy about that. You may wonder why was it that it took so long for Christian sculpture to emerge, and why actually in the East they're still deeply suspicious of Christian sculpture. Basically because it was associated with paganism. And so it was really 600 years or so before Christians began to do sculpture in the round as opposed to icons and paintings. So here we are in the year 975 with the Garowe Crucifix in Cologne. We get a clear symbol of Christ, truly human, truly dead, on the cross. Now look at this just for a second, wall painting of the Crucifixion from the middle of the 8th century in the Church of St. Maria Antiqua in Rome. You can see there that Christ is fully alive, eyes wide open, body upright, in no way dead or defeated. But look at this from about the same period, probably the same period, the middle of the 8th century. The dating of this is not absolutely certain, but it's probably the middle of the 8th century. This is an icon from St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. Now here you can see that compared with the one at St. Maria Antiqua, which I've just shown you, Christ, although he's upright on the cross, seems to have his eyes closed, and blood is coming from his side, and he's got clearly some indication of a crown or chaplet on his head. So what has happened is that the image of Jesus dead on the cross begins to emerge about the middle of the 8th century. And this, if it is the middle of the 8th century, is perhaps the earliest depiction that we have. And as I said, there was a great reluctance, first of all, for Christians to depict Christ on the cross at all, and secondly, an even greater reluctance to depict him dead. The reluctance to depict him at all, as I say, sprang partly because of the unfortunate images of the crucifixion with capital punishment, as we would call it, but no less because if the church believed, as it did, that Christ was truly human and truly God, and yet Jesus was one person, undivided, how could you possibly convey that truth in artistic forms? If you simply depicted Jesus as truly human, actually dying, well, what about his divinity? And if you tried to depict God, well, you can't. Christians thought you can't depict God. So there was a huge, huge theological problem. And the artistic solution to that only really emerged, as I say, about halfway through the 8th century. And the way they did it was by really having two images. They began to depict Jesus dead on the cross as one image, and then at the same time there emerged the image of the anastasis, of Christ's resurrection from the dead, or as we in the West would usually call it, Christ's descent to the dead, which I will be talking about in my lecture next month, where Christ is shown raiding Hades, pulling the souls out of Hades, and stamping his cross through the devil at the bottom. This emerged also by about the middle of the 8th century. So it looked as though they solved the problem in this kind of way by the development of two images fairly simultaneously. But by the 11th century, as I indicated in my very first lecture, the orthodox iconography had emerged really fully formed. And this is a very characteristic orthodox image of the crucifixion. This is from that lovely church of Hosios Lukos, dating from 1020. It's a mosaic. And here you can see of course, that Jesus is depicted dead on the cross, with the blood coming from his feet onto Golgotha, where, according to legend, Adam was buried. So the redeeming blood of Christ is flowing onto Golgotha and redeeming Adam, who is, of course, a symbol of humanity as a whole. Up at the top, I should have mentioned these before in earlier images, they very often like to show the sun and the moon. But first of all, because of the biblical references to sun and moon worshipping God, but also to indicate the kind of cosmic significance of the crucifixion. Now, what is very remarkable to me is that when Cardinal Humbert came to Constantinople in 1054, that is, just 20 years after this mosaic was completed, he was shocked to see this kind of image. He said, "How do you come to fasten to Christ's cross the picture of a dying man?" And this was one of the reasons that he promulgated an anathema against the Orthodox Church. And this is quite extraordinary, isn't it? Because, in fact, as I've already showed you, the image of Christ dying on the cross had already begun to emerge in the West, further to the West, in the Garowe Crucifix in Cologne, dating from the 10th century, a century earlier. And it had been around by this time in the East for at least 100 years. So it's surprising that he was so shocked. Perhaps he was shocked because Jesus was shown in a loincloth, semi-naked, rather than a colobium. But it's surprising that he should do that. Now we come now to another extremely important and equally interesting image and theme. This is the Volto Santo, the Holy Face, from Laka in Italy, just north of Pisa, dating from the 12th century. And here you see that Christ is clearly depicted as a priest on the cross. What's interesting about this is that you can see there is a priestly robe with a girdle, and that may be a reference to a verse in the book of Revelation, where Christ is, there's a vision of Christ as a high priest in a robe. It's thought that this image of Christ as the priest at Lucca may have been based on one at San Sepolcro in Italy. This is the one from San Sepolcro in Italy, which may be the 8th or 9th century, or possibly the 12th century. There's a close-up of the face. But also there's some very, very arresting, similar ones. That's the one in San Sepolcro. There's some, sorry, they're not. This is the very arresting one from Barcelona. If you ever go to Barcelona, there's a wonderful, wonderful museum of Catalan art. And in that museum you have these what are called majestars, which are pictures of Christ in kind of priestly royal robes as a high priest on the cross. They're very arresting, I find these. What I also discovered and found very interesting is this carving on the outside of the church in Langford in West Oxfordshire, dating from the 12th century, using exactly the same iconography as that one at Lucca. And the reason is, first of all, that Lucca was on the pilgrimage route from Canterbury to Rome, or rather Compostela, and secondly, because Lucca had a guild of merchants that traded with England. And clearly what has happened is that this very, very famous image in Lucca, which at the time they believed had been carved by Nicodemus, came to England, and right in West Oxfordshire they'd carved a similar image of Christ as a priest on the cross on the outside of a church. What's also interesting is the outside of that church is that there's a slightly different image of Christ dead on the cross, but with a crown on his head. Victorian restorers got that the wrong way round, so the arms looking a little bit akimbo. But this image of Christ dead on the cross with a crown on his head can often be seen in metal crucifixes, and there were lots in this country, even more in Norway and Scandinavia. There you can see a very, very typical example of Christ, the King, on the cross. And here, in a 12th century Salter, you have a combination of both those images, Christ as King and Christ as priest. You can see very priestly garments, even with the priestly colour of purple there, and purple colour of death, but also the priestly stole there. Christ as both priest and king. This is the Amesbury Salter from the year 1250. What's interesting about this is that the cross is shown as a tree. One of the sort of recurring images is the cross as the tree of life, and you can see it's a very, very rugged tree of life. But also what happened in the 12th and 13th century is, first of all, a greater image on the blood pouring from the side of Christ. There it's looking a little bit more difficult to see, but it is still there. And that gave rise to the cult of the Sacred Heart, because the wound on the side of Christ was seen as a way, devotional way into the heart of Christ, as to meditate upon the blood, was to come into the heart of Christ himself. But also you'll see there what we would call a crown of thorns, except that it isn't a crown of thorns. It's a little chaplet of palm, a chaplet of rushes. And what happened is that 1239, Louis IX received this chaplet of rushes, believed to be the crown of thorns, from Constantinople. It was only in the 14th century that it became a crown of thorns. But at about this time, they became a great emphasis upon trying to enter devotionally and prayerfully into the sufferings of Christ on the cross. This is what's called a Man of Sorrows. It's a Byzantine icon dating from about the year 1260. This was a very, very important devotional image in Constantinople. It was brought to the Church of Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome, and much revered. It can either be shown with head and shoulders or part body length. But at this time also there developed a very, very intense spirituality, both Franciscan and Dominican. For instance, a Franciscan prayer at this time reads, "O how intensely thou embraced me, good Jesu, when the blood which went forth from thy heart, the water from thy side, the soul from thy body. Most sweet youth, what hast thou done that thou shouldest suffer so? Surely I too am the cause of thy sorrow." There was a great emphasis upon getting not just priests but lay people to, as it were, kneel before an image of Christ as the Man of Sorrows. Imagine they were there, imagine that they were responsible in part for the crucifixion. And it engendered, as you can imagine, a very intense devotion. Now what happened was that the Carthusians who owned this church in Rome needed to raise more money for it, so they had a print made by Israel van Meckenham. This is a later print, of course, from about 1490. And this was a very typical image of the Man of Sorrows as it was in print. And the importance about this is that I think it's been well described as the most precise image of late medieval piety. It's a piety of intimacy, of compassion and intercession. Now, another theme which began to emerge in the 12th century and went through until the Reformation was the image of the tree of Jesse. From the 11th century, psalters and stained glass windows started to depict Jesse lying on the bottom there, the father of David, and from his body arises in the middle all the kings leading up to Jesus, down the center, and all the prophets on the branches on either side. And this eventually gave rise to the Lily Crucifix. This is at St Helens, Abingdon, dated from about 1391, because it came to be believed that March the 25th, the feast of the Annunciation, was also the day on which Christ was crucified. So we have this wonderful conjunction of images. The tree of Jesse comes up to the top where there is a lily, and Christ, instead of being crucified on a cross, is as it were hanging on a lily, because March the 25th is both the Annunciation, the birth of Christ, the lily signifying Mary, of course, and the day he was crucified. This was rediscovered when I was Bishop of Oxford a few years. It was on the back of a panel in St Helens, Abingdon, and restored. And it's a very, very wonderful and striking image, delicate beauty and repose. Now, as a result of the carvers, Gothic carvers, particularly in the north of Europe, people began to do carving in Italy as well, and they began to depict the crucifixion in a very crowded and dramatic way. This is on the pulpit of Siena Cathedral by Nicola Pisano from the 13th century, but also in Siena we get that very famous depiction by Duccio, the same century. And the reason I'm showing those is at that time they developed the image of the crowded, dramatic scenes of the crucifixion, as opposed to the ones that I show you from Osius Lucas, where you only have Mary and John, which is a much more traditional one. But also at this same time, there became, as it were, a totally contrary emphasis upon a single stark image of Jesus on the cross. And this was a result of the influence particularly of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who wanted to clear away all the clutter from their churches and focus people's devotion simply upon an image of the cross hanging right in the center. This is a very powerful example of Cimabue from the 13th century, from San Domenico in Arezzo. A lot more could be said about that, but we need to move on, unfortunately. We've only got an hour. Now, some of you might recognize this as one of the most famous images of Christ on the cross altogether. It is the Isenheim Altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald, who died in 1528. One unusual feature is there's a picture of John the Baptist there, pointing to Jesus as the Lamb of God. Of course, there's a lamb at his feet, making that pretty obvious. But what is so startling and shocking, of course, is the close-up of that. And the background to this is that this painting by Grunewald was painted for the Order of St. Anthony, who tended the sick, particularly those suffering from the disease called ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire. They were brought into the chapel where a miracle was prayed for, that they might indeed be healed. But if no miracle occurred, at least they knew, if they looked at this picture, that Christ himself went through the most intense agony, as they could see by looking at the spiky thorns and the results of the flagellation on his body. They knew that Christ was suffering with them. Now, one of the major influences at this time were the visions of Bridget, who was the founder of the religious order called the Brigatines, because she had great visions of Christ's suffering, and this influenced Grunewald and a number of other people at the time. Now, one of the interesting features about this, although it was quite well known in its own time, it wasn't much talked about in the 19th century, but in 1918, the picture was shown in Munich, and somehow it seemed to fit the German self-image of an anguished, martyred people, and so also German expressionism, with which this painting has affinities. And later on, of course, this idea of a suffering, martyred people fitted not just the German, but seemed to fit the whole of the suffering 20th century. And it's not surprising that the great theologian Paul Tillich called this the greatest German painting that's ever been painted. Now, a rather different image which began to emerge a little bit later in the 17th century was simply Jesus totally alone on the cross, not so much in obvious agony, but alone. This is an image that develops in Spain, particularly. There are a number of images like this, particularly the one of Velázquez. This is a Velázquez one. But let me just pause a little bit longer on the one by Rembrandt. It was only discovered to be by Rembrandt, this, actually in 1959. Before that, it wasn't quite sure who it was by. But obviously, this is trying to depict the moment of dereliction, where Jesus on the cross calls out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And I like to think that this was painted by Rembrandt at a kind of transition point in his life, because you remember that his early paintings are very baroque, very grand, very dramatic, and then later on in his life, as a result of a number of terrible tragedies, the death of his wife and 3 children, bankruptcy, his paintings became very, very different, much more intense, rather powerful, subdued in some way, but very, very powerful. And sometimes wonder whether this was sort of at a transitional point in his time. It's still got something of the sort of grand about it, but clearly it's a moment of darkness. Now, something very, very different. There are many fine portraits and landscapes in the 18th century, but in my view, most art on a Christian theme is uninspiring. But the Romantic movement brought a new intensity of religious feeling towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. But this religious feeling was expressed not so much through traditional iconography, but through landscape. And this is a painting by Caspar David Friedrich, 1774 to 1840, Morning in the Reisenberg. So the emphasis is upon, as it were, the religion in and through the landscape. But there's a very kind of isolated, lonely cross with a single figure reaching up to it, which also seems to express a sort of sense of individuality and isolation of the artist, and perhaps the emerging consciousness of that time. Now, when we come to our own time, here we have an image of perhaps the greatest religious painter of the 20th century, Rouault. Won't surprise you to know that he originally trained as a stained glass painter, or that he suffered a major breakdown. There's a tremendous sense of pathos and pity in that, in the Christ who looks down upon a suffering world. Indeed, one of the favourite quotations for Rouault was taken from Pascal: "Christ suffers until the end of the world." This is a very unusual painting by Marc Chagall, a Russian Jew who painted a number of scenes which included Christ on the cross. This was painted as a result of his experience of the Jewish pogroms in 1938-39. All around the edge you can see pictures of Jews suffering, and in the middle there's a very Jewish Christ in a Jewish shawl with the great light of the Torah running right from heaven down through the cross and then onto the Torah scroll, which is outlined to the bottom one of the corners. So obviously, or is he, question mark, is he trying to say that Jesus the Jew is suffering with his own people? Now, when I've given predecessors of this lecture in other places at other times, I've always left this one out. And always in the questions afterwards, people say, why didn't you show the Salvador Dali? So I'm showing it this time. And the reason is that I'm ambivalent about this picture. It was painted in 1951 and purchased by the Glasgow Art Gallery, where you can still see it for £8,200. It met with fierce criticism from all art critics of the time. They said it was far too expensive and it was poor art. But it immediately proved hugely popular, and it is probably the most popular and the most reproduced of all Christian images of the 20th century. And Dali deliberately set out to paint something totally different from Grunewald. He said, no more surrealist malaise of existential angst. I want to paint a Christ that is painting with more beauty and joy than has ever been painted before. And so the figure of Christ on the cross there is that of a beautiful human body. And he sets it in the village where he lived, Port Liget, in the eastern Spain, with little figures at the bottom drawn from various 17th century paintings, Spanish paintings. This I've reproduced by Marc Chagall, an American artist born in 1948, because it is typical of so many images of the crucifixion in the 20th century, which simply want to depict suffering, sheer anguish, sheer despair, sheer suffering, which fitted the terrible suffering of that 20th century. One of the most familiar, what in many people's view would be the most significant religious paintings just in the last decade or two is Norman Adams. And in Manchester there's a series of Stations of the Cross, and in a little church called St Mary's the Hidden Gem. And this is one of the images of Christ in that Stations of the Cross, where you can see the sadness, the dolor, the suffering of Christ. All the images of the Stations of the Cross are like that. But then he tries to do a final image which depicts something of the resurrection. I'm not showing that because there's an even more remarkable painting, in my view, of Norman Adams, which is this, which is the butterfly cross. And the reason I'm showing this is because in the 20th century it was so easy simply to depict the agony of Christ on the cross. But how on earth do you depict the triumph of Jesus on the cross? How do you depict even a hint of the resurrection? It's difficult to do visually in any century, particularly difficult to do in the 20th century, where we're so suspicious of any kind of happy ending. Now, Norman Adams has clearly tried it here, because you have a figure of Christ on the cross, but it is also a joyful, triumphant figure, as expressed in those butterfly wings, which are, as it were, flowing out from him. And there may be a hint of the same thing in Craigie Aitchison. Craigie Aitchison, this is one of the best-known religious images of the 20th century. Craigie Aitchison's little figure of Christ drooped on this cross. So many of his scores and scores of his paintings, just like this. But I came across this one the other day in an exhibition by Craigie Aitchison, which is not just a figure of Christ drooped on the cross, but is, as it were, is almost a transfiguration or transformation into another medium altogether. Is he also trying to indicate that death is not the end, the cross is not the end, that Christ has brought something else? Perhaps the most famous of the modern British artists is Maggi Hambling. And every Good Friday she devotes the whole day to painting the scene of Jesus on the cross. This is one of ones she did one year. Another very powerful contemporary Christian artist is Peter Ball. If you go to Winchester Cathedral, you'll see quite a number of examples of his work. This is a risen Christ, but also with arms outstretched, indicating the cross, his robe patterned with cosmic designs, both a crucifixion and an embrace of the world. This is by Helen Mayer. It's a friend of mine. She did a series of Stations of the Cross, which we did for a television program. I find this very deeply moving depiction of Jesus on the cross, great tenderness in it. And this again is something very, very different. Cecil Collins is obviously wanting to indicate not just the death of Christ on the cross, but something of the triumph. So you have tambourines, you have the soldiers and the spikes on one side, the mourning in the middle, but on the other side there's the dancing, there's the joy, and Jesus on the cross is looking down that side. This is the second last image I'm showing. This you'll see in Oxford, in St Giles Church in Oxford, painted by Roger Wagner. It's on the one hand, it's Didcot power stations. On the other hand, it's the menorah, the Jewish seven-branch candlestick from which it gets its name. And on the other hand, it's also, of course, the ovens of Auschwitz. So this is a very risky attempt to somehow indicate that the suffering of Jesus and the suffering of Auschwitz, of the Jewish people as a result of the Holocaust, are to be seen in some way together. Very powerful painting. And then the last one, which I'm showing simply because this is another very interesting attempt, this time by John Riley, who died last year, where he's not just trying to show Christ defeated on the cross, but also a Christ triumphant on the cross, because here there's a Christ, as it were, beginning to dance away into a circle of eternity. So I'm sorry the last bit of that has been a bit rushed. You can find out more, a little bit more, on some of those images anyway, in a book I wrote a few years ago, and somebody kindly brought one along just to remind me that I'd written it, called The Passion in Art, published by Ashgate, if you want a little bit more on some of those images, though I have actually shown you some, with quite a number, which are not in that book. Next month we will be dealing with the resurrection of Christ. Thank you very much.